Good afternoon, Jamie. I'm excited to have this conversation with you about this really exciting book that I just read a couple of weeks ago.
Good afternoon. Wait, before we go forward,
Okay.
Your audio is a little distorted for me.
Oh, okay.
Taina, I don't know if you can stop it and start it again.
Is it? Oh, we can't hear you now. So is it my audio? Do I need to change?
It did recommend I put earbuds in if I was having a distorted audio, but can you say again, Leslie?
Yes. So let's do like Krista Tippett does. And what did I have for breakfast this morning? Some almonds.
It's crunchy.
It's crunchy. All right, let me go find different. Let me go find different things. Hold on.
I'm also getting my headphones set up to figure out the input here.
¿Quieres saludar? Vente. Vente para que me hicieron. Sí, quieres saludar. ¿Quieres decir hi? Yeah, it's highs. It's highs. It's highs and hellos. It's highs and hellos. Oh. It's highs and hellos. Yeah, you're okay, puppy. Okay. Vete por ahí. Vete. Vete. Good job. Okay.
All right. Good afternoon, Jamie. I'm very excited to be having this conversation with you about this really fantastic book that I just finished reading recently.
Yes, and which book would that be?
And that would be You Lied to Me About God. Yeah, I'm really excited about this conversation.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. I think I first met you. Did you do some workshops up in Lansing? Lansing or Grand Rapids? Yes. So that was the first time I met you.
I was on the Pertz circuit for a lot of years before I founded Institute for Creative Mindfulness and became an EMDR provider.
Okay.
And I know I got closer to you through Mara, of course, of Touchstone Institute, and then you getting involved with ICM. But I remember, I think after those events in Michigan, we friended each other on Facebook because we had some great conversations there before I really even knew about your EMDR connection and perinatal connection.
Yeah. I think actually I was going to mention that too, because I think you are maybe the only person in all of human history that responded favorably to my internet rantings of, you have to put captions on your videos because that's traumatizing to people. And you were like, yes, absolutely. Let me fix that. And so I have always just been so appreciative of that in my life. Part of my life has been with the deaf community, people who can't access content unless it's captioned. And so that was always so super meaningful to me. So I
appreciate it. And I appreciated that dialogue because until you reached out, I don't think I realized from a production standpoint, I mean, it does take an extra step, yet it's not that difficult to caption your content at all. There's so many programs now that make it available. And so I think the lesson in that is reach out even to people who you think might be like at an elevated presence as an educator. I mean, we learn, I can say, when people reach out to us, letting us know how we could do things better. So yeah, that was my first direct memory of our interaction as well. And I'm grateful you brought that up.
Yes. So I have since that time, I have been an avid reader of your books. I really like the way that you write. And I was appreciative to get an advanced copy of this particular book. And in reading your book, it was just another really fantastic experience, which I had with a lot of your books. This one and Dissociation Made Simple, I think, were the two that I really felt like sometimes I just had to put it down and like percolate it on a little bit. Like I would read a passage or read a chapter or a paragraph and like, oh, I need to be with that for a minute. And then there were certain points that I was like, I cannot put this down. It was more like this. But I cannot put this down. And I really love the through line that connect a lot of your books about the invitation for expressive arts. That I think is a really important piece for a reader, because I think of books that I've read over the years, I read What My Bones Know in the past
Mhm,
year, and even thinking, way this is way, way back, but thinking back when I read A Child Called It, they were
mhm,
two kind of books, and they're different than your books because those
mhm,
two, at least to my mind, had a lot more physical descriptions,
mhm.
of physical
Yep.
abuse,
Mhm,
whereas this one is not so much, but you can kind of talk about that
mhm,
when we jump into it. But I really just felt like as I was reading those two books, especially as I was reading What My Bones Know, like I was getting kind of activated reading these
mhm,
books. And
mhm,
I so love how your book also speaks to the people who are reading it, but also the clinicians, and here's what you can do about it, and just also takes care of the reader of, hey, if there's something going on for you, here's some things that you can do to
mhm.
help calm, to help regulate your nervous system, as we say.
Thank you for noticing that
Hmm.
because I'm an avid reader of memoir. I'm an avid
Hmm.
reader of lived experience narratives, and when I read other clinical writers, I like when they get real. When I'm reading a pure memoir
Yeah,
like A
yeah.
Child Called It, which was formational for me,
Hmm.
it's definitely pure memoir and lived experience. And I know in my life, I've been in different places with needing to read either more detail, less detail, etc. But in all of my books, and especially now that with You Lied to Me About God, I've really crossed the threshold into pure memoir. I use this phrase tongue in cheek. Hopefully, it's respectful enough. I don't like to trauma porn my readers,
Yeah. Yep. Yep.
meaning like real graphic description of things that happen. And part of it
Hmm.
was that intense physical trauma was not my experience. I did have
Hmm.
some sexual assault
Hmm.
trauma, but even there, I feel like giving enough detail to paint a picture in circumstances is needed. But I have always leaned more in my personal writing to reflecting more on my internal process or the
Hmm.
recovery from it. And it's not to say that memoirs that get more graphic aren't necessarily useful either, if that's where the reader's in the right place to take that in. But
Hmm.
one thing that I appreciate about a good memoir is if it gets me as the reader to do some of my own work as a result of reading the memoir, to
Hmm.
look at what about this author's experience am I resonating with, even if there's something that feels different than my lived experience, but it's still striking a chord. I think the
Hmm.
deeper invitation there is what's that chord and how can I play it and work with it. So,
Hmm.
as you referenced throughout You Lied to Me About God, which is a memoir, and I even pitched it to my publisher as it's going to be different than some of my other books, which are written a little bit more for a clinical audience. Whereas this one, because people had asked me for years to write a book about spiritual trauma, because I've been talking about it in a lot of my trauma education. And I
Hmm.
even told my publisher I couldn't write this book unless I could write it as a memoir, because talking about spiritual abuse and religious trauma is so personal to me. It's the most significant traumas that I experienced, that we experienced. And it really is so much of what led us into our recovery and thus into this field.
Hmm.
So even though we wrote it as something that hopefully memoir readers can appreciate, at the end of each chapter, as you referenced, there are expressive arts exercises that I offer as an invitation, really for the purpose of helping people tap into their own story in the most general sense, even
Hmm.
more specifically, their own spiritual autobiography, spiritual journey. Because I think to really help others with it, if you are a clinician, we have to have a sense of where we're coming from
Hmm.
spiritually, or if religious or spiritual abuse was part of our story, getting a sense of that.
Yeah. Yeah. I That invitation, I think, even helped me in there was a couple things that really helped me. One is that experience of like, this isn't just me. Like other people have experienced
Mhm,
the same thing that maybe I have experienced. And I really enjoyed the way, or at least the opening to the idea of exploring your own spiritual life, your own religious your own healing through this, still within, it sounds like, the religious tradition of your upbringing. Because I
mhm,
think there's so many of us, like me, having also been raised Catholic, gone to Catholic school, that at some point we just tap out. Like I just walked away. I was
mhm,
like, well, I guess this doesn't have anything to do with me, so I'm just going to
mhm,
leave. And the invitation to continue to explore my faith identity, or how religion can be part of my life, I think was really interesting. So, to that end, can you talk a little bit more about your writing process practically and emotionally?
hmm Yeah, I love that question. I
Mm.
adore any discussion about process. It's just, I
Mhm,
love
mhm,
hearing other artists process, other writers process.
mhm,
So this book was not unlike some of, because as we've already alluded to, my books up to this point have been largely written for a clinical audience. Or but some of my books, like Dissociation Made Simple, Trauma and the 12 Steps, Process Not Perfection, it's kind of like a dual audience where
mhm,
if you're a
mhm.
clinician, my hope is you can take this into your clinical work. But if you are a person in recovery who's seeking more information, then hopefully
Yes.
um, this will help you too. My process for this book was not unlike the others, which is by time I go to write a book, I have talked about my topic so much
Mhm,
that writing just
mhm,
is like the last natural step in the
mhm,
journey, right?
mhm, mhm,
Because, like, for instance, with Dissociation Made Simple, which you referenced, I had been consulting on dissociation for a lot of years. Prior to that, I had been treated for dissociation disorder. I've done a lot of therapy
mhm,
about it.
mhm,
Then I started doing trainings on it, and then some blogs and articles, and all of those experiences. By time I go to write the book, it's not that tricky for me. It's a
mhm,
flow. Now, with You Lied to Me About
mhm,
God, it was pretty similar because I've been talking about spiritual abuse since I became an EMDR therapist and consultant. I
mhm,
crossed the line into consultation 2008, 2010, started doing advanced topics. And I have long been one to platform spiritual abuse as a legitimate form of abuse and trauma. And I've even done
mhm,
some separate trainings on it. Again, I've had a lot of my own personal therapy about many of the themes and stories that are in the book. I've spoken with other consultees about it. So by the time I went to write the book, yes, I even say this in the book, it's both the easiest and the hardest book I ever had to write. What
mhm.
made it easy
Can
was
imagine.
it just flowed out of me. These
Mhm,
stories had to be told. I had to put them on paper. And as at the time of this recording, I had also just recorded the audiobook last week.
mhm,
And that was
mhm.
another layer of, wow, I didn't realize I needed this part of the processing to be able to
Yeah, yeah,
speak it out as well.
yeah.
What made it difficult, this book, but now that I think about it, I've had this on some level with my other clinical books too, because you know me, I'm not exactly quiet about some of my opinions. So when I wrote,
I love
this
it.
is it's a helpful question. I'm making a connection.
It
So when I wrote EMDR Made Simple, it was very much a rebel EMDR book. I was flying in the face of what a lot of Shapiro and the establishment had taught at that time.
Mhm, mhm.
And I remember thinking like the EMDR mafia was going to come and get me if
Oh,
this book made too many people angry. And so
yeah.
that was my fear at the time. And all these years later,
Mm,
to hear how many people that book positively affected. So
mhm,
with You Lied to Me About God, um, I'm directly speaking my voice towards
mhm.
very powerful institutions here, most notably my own
Yeah,
family, because my
yeah,
family remains very religious. So
yeah.
you mentioned growing up Catholic, as I explain in the book. I grew up with one Catholic parent and one evangelical parent. He converted
Mhm,
when I was a very young child, and they both stayed very religious and they both
mhm.
couldn't stand each other's religions. And as the oldest
Wow.
child, I was put in the middle of a lot of their arguments. My
Yep.
brother is a Catholic priest. I worked for the
Mhm,
Catholic Church once I chose Catholicism coming out of my parents' home, but then ultimately the institutional grip of that was not meant to hold me. And
mhm,
so as I explore in the book, my journey goes down a lot of paths, and I remain somebody who I identify now as a person of faith. I'm a deep person of faith. I still value so much of what religious tradition and religious practice teaches, yet so many of my views on social justice just
mhm,
don't connect with what a lot of institutional
mhm,
religion teaches. Now that being said, there's a lot of flavors of Christianity that have become remarkably progressive. I know there's a lot of flavors of other world religions. I don't mean flavors disrespectfully, interpretations, if you will.
mhm.
Um, denominations, that there's all different kinds of Christians. And that's something that I really do try to drive home in the book, that even as a queer person, as somebody who's deeply committed to social justice causes, I don't think religion is fundamentally the problem. It's what people do in the name of religion.
Yeah.
And to never assume that one Christian speaks for all Christians. And so the book was an unwinding and unraveling of many years, that when I went to write the book, it was deeply healing for me. But yeah, a lot of people aren't going to like it, including people that are close to me. I've had the conversations with people where they were willing. But yeah, there are just some things that needed to be said that I feel I've said in the book, really about this whole idea of institution, because family is an institution just as much as church would be. And in cases of spiritual abuse and religious trauma, oftentimes the two work off each other.
Speaking a little more about families, this is when we are recording this is July. I know myself, clinically, I'm talking to a lot of families. So a lot of the work that I do is perinatal work.
Right.
I'm talking with a lot of people about, I always call it the damn trip up north, because families have to take this trip up north, blended families, family of origins have to go up north. And there's so many expectations and so many divergent views about families, and even weaving in even religious traditions. So, I mean, your family had a lot of divergent views religiously, let alone any type of, well, also including some social ideas.
Right.
So I wonder, even taking this in July of 2024, I wonder if you have any ideas. This is like a huge question, but I wonder if you have any ideas about families, how we be together with our families when there's such divergent views. And how do we align our families together when that is so hard? And how do we align across families, across religious traditions? I don't know, that may be too large of a
it's
concept.
A big question, I agree, but it's a fascinating question.
But it is an interesting, like, I always think of it as like the micro becomes the macro. So, I mean, anywhere you want to touch within there, of like, how do we even align within our own families? And then that just continues to expand farther in our whole society as we're grappling with so many different things.
As I'm chewing on this, both as a clinician and as somebody who has experienced.
How do you be with your family?
Yeah.
How do you be with your family?
But I think on the macro, something I want us to understand is, don't assume that what family means to you is what it means to me. Because I see so many people crushed under the weight of assumptions and expectations around family. I tackle in the book this whole notion that so many of us receive that family is everything. We get it in many factions of society. I know in both flavors of Christianity in which I was raised, it was very much your family's everything. The family, the family, the family. I even make a joke in the book, the family. My friend from Ireland will say it that way as a commentary about how certain church leaders will make provocations that gay marriage, for instance, is threatening the family. And this idea of family is sacred and all families have to look like the Holy Family. And I'm like that. And as I think I would feel this way even if I wasn't queer, but family of choice, or rather family of choice, has become a very important concept to me, that there are people who are friends and mentors and colleagues who I love deeply as my family, because I feel they're able to give me what a lot of people in my blood family were not able to give me. Or, as I really came to terms with in the book, some people in my blood family were able to meet certain needs and others were able to meet others. That I don't think you could ever expect any one person to be what the Hallmark card tells you they should be, right? For instance, in the book, I talk very favorably about my uncles and aunts and cousins, how they were there to offer me a lot of what I consider to be a normal childhood experience that I didn't get, because my father really had absolutely no attitude towards things like secular
Mhm.
television and
Mhm.
secular music and whatnot.
Wow.
So, I mean, all of that I think is don't make expectations. I
Mhm.
don't think we should
Mhm.
put expectations either. This is going a little off tangent about how people grieve.
Yeah.
As somebody who's had difficult relationships with my parents, I can appreciate that when a parent dies, it may not mean the same thing to you as it might mean to
Mhm.
someone else. And
Mhm.
so all of that being said, how does one be with their family, especially when we're in these settings? I mean, I had a really bad meltdown in 2016 that I talk about in the book. It was a
Mhm.
pretty significant mental health crisis, self-injury, relapse, dissociative break that I had even as Dr. Jamie Marich. I was out there and a lot of things
Mhm.
just weighed on me because my second marriage was ending. The US political climate was bringing up a lot of reminders.
Mhm.
And even there, so much of why I was even in this marriage I had no business being in was I was playing out family and societal expectations that I should be married, I should have children. And a
Mhm.
great freedom I had is when a lot of that lifted. So, okay, let's go back to how does one be with their family? Something I learned during that break is, especially as an adult, as an adult who's child free, I can say, or I am a step parent from that
Mhm.
second marriage, and the kids still
Yep.
stayed in my life, which is a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
But I learned not to let obligation come before my mental health.
Mhm.
And that might mean telling the family I can't come for Thanksgiving this year.
Mhm. Yeah.
And they might say all kind of horrible things about me, yet
Yeah.
ultimately I'm the one whose job it is to keep ourselves alive. Ourselves
Yeah.
meaning the
Yeah.
internal system.
Yeah.
And I think when I have freed myself of obligation, I am able to show up for my family in a lot of ways because I want to.
Mhm.
I was at a major
Mm.
religious I was at a major religious event in my family over the weekend. And
Mhm.
the metaphor I used is I can, and I didn't even feel like obligation at this point. I wanted to
Mhm.
be there. I wanted to be there to support this
Yeah.
family member. I knew I had to zip in a lot of my true self for a couple hours to
Mhm.
really make it as comfortable as possible. And I think even in
Mhm.
my family, we've come to an understanding that in order to keep relationships with each other in our lives, we don't talk about certain things
Yep.
and we have each other's presence in our lives in measured doses. People who are in my family of choice, and this does include some of my cousins, in
Mhm.
fairness, because a lot of
Mhm.
them are wonderful and we've connected. I don't have to wear the corset, so to speak. I actually said this with my EMDR therapist this week that being around my family
Oh,
can be like wearing a corset,
yeah.
like women did for so many years. And
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
can do it in measured doses.
Yeah.
Especially because I still want to, like, I willingly put on the corset.
Mhm.
I believe I
Yep.
crossed the threshold where because I said no to enough family events for the sake of my own mental health, I could now go willingly.
Mhm.
But I am always looking at, am I acting out of obligation as an
Yep.
adult? And
It's a
it's
good
tricky.
distinction.
Yeah, it's trickier. Is this something I want to be doing, or is it some combination of the two? Or if I
Mhm.
have to act out of obligation for a certain period of time, can I give myself a treat at some point later where I could really let the corset out?
Yeah.
Because having an
Yeah.
internal system, I have a lot of these little ones that are inside of me that are always crying out, crying out. And I know, like, for every day of family contact, I have to give the rest of my system a couple days to recoup and
Yeah.
chill out and really just let ourselves be ourselves
Yeah.
in the
Yeah.
world. And hopefully that's the kind of authenticity that we're working towards anyway, to show up how we need to show up as we are in our life.
Yeah.
But sometimes um yeah, I can keep it zipped in for social graces. And
Mhm.
but that's why
Yeah.
family of choice becomes so important. And I do
Yeah.
fundamentally, I think another element of this is because I've had to navigate through and work through so much, even though I'm speaking up against a lot of stuff I experienced, I really do
Mhm.
love my family to the point
Yeah.
where I would know if I absolutely had to stay away from my mental health, because I have done
Mhm.
that at certain periods in
Mhm.
my life. But
Mhm.
I still have a lot of love and compassion. And I even share in the book that I do believe I have forgiven my parents. But the only
Mm.
reason I'm
Wow.
able to, because forgiveness is loaded. It's a loaded term.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
A lot of people think you kind of have these battles, and therapists like, do people have to forgive to get over trauma? And my
Mhm.
big feeling on that is no, forgiveness is a religious term. I don't
Oh,
think you
interesting.
need I don't think
How do
you
you
need
define
it.
it?
Well, that's a good question. It's like, what does forgiveness mean to you? You know, like, what does
Sure,
family
sure.
mean to you? I think forgiveness can mean a lot of things. It means that,
Mhm.
in a way, like, I pardon you, I release
Ah,
the hold you have on me. I don't
mhm.
think forgiving somebody means you have
Is
to
what you did
forget.
was okay. Right,
Yeah, it doesn't,
right.
mean
Mhm.
acceptance. It doesn't mean
Mhm.
now that I have
Mhm.
forgiven you, I'm going on as if everything is peachy keen, because I think
Right.
that's what a lot of institutions would have us do. That
Mhm.
forgiveness is needed for healing, but they would
Mhm.
define it as then like sweep it under the carpet like never nothing
Right,
ever
right, right,
happened. And
right,
so I believe you can still forgive somebody, but hold them accountable. That's
right,
really
right,
a lot of
right.
what I'm doing in this book. I know for a lot of years I practiced very superficial forgiveness because the
Sure.
churches I was raised in told me I had to. You have to forgive
Mhm.
your
Mhm.
parents and the people who did this, or you're the bad person if you don't forgive. And
Right,
I learned, and
right.
this was a gift EMDR therapy gave to me, that in order to truly forgive, if that's your calling, you really have to have a thorough working through.
Yeah.
And forgiveness could be superficial and premature, and that's not helping anyone.
Mhm. I think I don't know if Oprah came up with it herself, but I heard it from her in a definition that it sounds like a lot of what you're saying is forgiveness is letting go that the past could have been different than it was. And I sometimes
Yeah.
like that as an idea of like the working through piece, that there's
Yeah.
not some responsibility that we have to
Right.
make that be different or
And
to
this is
make the
why,
situation be different.
yes. And to that Oprah definition, sorry, I was like percolating. I
Yeah,
was
sure.
listening. Um, I think acceptance is an even bigger thing than forgiveness. And that
Mm, mm,
definition she gave of forgiveness is probably how I would define acceptance. And
nice.
as a 12-step person,
Mhm.
having come up in the 12 steps, even though I've also rebelled
Mhm.
against some 12-step notions,
Mhm.
this idea that acceptance is the answer to all my problems today has
Yes.
really fueled me. And I write about this in the memoir as well,
Mhm.
that accepting something, and this was made very clear to me by my first recovery sponsor, accepting something doesn't mean that you have to like it. It doesn't mean that you're
Yeah.
saying it's okay, but you release your grip, again, either on the past
Mm.
happening as it happened, or you can
Mhm.
release your grip over the fact that somebody's going to change. Somebody's going to
Mhm.
suddenly apologize and be different. And I
Mhm.
believe that was the biggest gift I got in my whole recovery journey, from both
Yeah.
addiction and trauma issues, sitting in a 12-step meeting and realizing, probably when I had about 8 months sober, the people in my life who I believe have wronged me may never change. They may never admit what they did was wrong.
Mhm.
And that's okay. Because to that point I was in my early 20s. To
Mhm.
that point in my life, I thought once I could get everybody else to understand and
Yep.
apologize,
Right?
that then I will be okay.
And it'll be fine. Mhm.
And the call it a grace, call it a bolt of lightning, call it just work having
Mhm.
finally clicked. It's like
Yeah.
that may never happen.
Yeah.
And that
Yeah.
doesn't matter, because I can be okay. And I realize my privilege in saying that. I don't think that
Sure.
personal lesson necessarily applies to larger social justice and restitution that needs to happen on other issues.
Right. Right,
But
right,
for
right.
me, for me personally, coming to that acceptance of they may never do better,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
I'm not going to let that get the best of me. So for me,
Yeah.
that's acceptance more than forgiveness. Forgiveness,
Yeah.
I think
I
I
like
think
it.
it's always going to have a religious connotation to me.
Yeah.
And I think if I'm looking at it more religiously, it's huh, helping me love them
Mm.
still the way that like God or Jesus might, but
Mhm.
I don't necessarily have to like or continue to subject myself to the same
Yeah.
behavior.
Yeah. Yeah. Nice. I will make sure that it's pretty easy to find online, right? Acceptance is the answer to all my problems today. But
Yep.
I'll also make sure that we get a link
Mhm.
to it in our show notes, as it were.
Yep.
Okay. If it's okay to shift gears a little bit, I would love
Please.
to hear how your views of reproductive justice have shifted over time.
I'd love to talk about this. So yes,
Mhm, mhm.
I grew up a pro-life warrior in both churches,
Yeah,
but I say that extending a lot of grace to myself because
right,
I spouted the pro-life talking points and did a lot of the pro-life advocacy work because that's what I was told to do as a
right,
kid.
right.
I grew up in my first 18 years of life not knowing any other way because in
Mhm,
both churches it was very clear you will be pro-life, which means anti-abortion as those churches defined it, and it was very clearly pitched to me as this is an issue of we as Christian people who are defending unborn babies versus the frivolousness of the world and women being able to do
mhm,
whatever they want and taking consequence, and it was very much pitched that way. And as I share in the book, my first understanding of really a larger world was when I did my undergraduate degree in college. And yes, it was the liberal arts institution that a lot of conservative parents
mhm,
fear. And
mhm.
yeah, probably as they should if they want to hold on to their grip, because the gift of going to a public school for my first 4 years of college was I got to meet other people from other walks of life.
Mhm,
And one of the professors, Dr. Wantata, who I talk about in the memoir, was a ethics and morals teacher, and I took a religious studies class with him in ethics and morals at the university, just because I heard he was a great teacher. He's from
mhm,
Cameroon. He had a lot of wonderful global perspectives on these things, and yeah, he really helped me to start to see, oh, it's not all about conservative Christianity if you want to be a moral and ethical person. And so I very much emerged from that class feeling like I wouldn't personally have an abortion, but if someone else
mhm,
needed to have one, I would at least get a larger story of what the context is and
mhm,
not be so judgmental. And then after my undergraduate years, I went back working for the Catholic Church for a while. So I kind of had this liberal awakening in my undergraduate, and then
okay, mhm.
because I ended up developing an addiction problem, the false equivalency I made, it was because I fell away from the church. And so
Oh,
I got religious again, but this time it was
mhm,
more Catholic. And it was the same thing that you have to be pro life if you're going to be a good Catholic. And this is why XYZ.
ah,
And I really, really, really credit the counseling profession here for helping
mhm,
me see the bigger picture. And Reverend Terry
right,
Williams, who has become a friend of mine here in the Faith Choice Ohio movement,
mhm,
really emphasizes that idea in an interview he did with me. When did you start to see the bigger picture? It's like, yes, that's exactly what being a clinician did for me, because
mhm,
I was working at a public agency just out of graduate school. So this was going on 20 years ago. And I was working with an individual. I won't tell the whole story here, largely because I'm protecting her privacy a lot, and
mhm,
there's a little more revealed in the book. But essentially, she was contemplating having an abortion, um, and I couldn't fault her for that because I
mhm,
saw the larger picture of what brought her to this place. And it was really this double standard she was in of she was damned if she did, damned if she didn't. That as an
mhm.
unwed mother, so many people were looking down on her for even getting pregnant in the first place. But then she was also being attacked with this other message of, but you better damn well have the baby.
Mhm.
And a good friend of mine from graduate school who was not a Catholic, but I met her in the community because I went to a very Catholic graduate school. She's also shared with me similar things, how she had
Mhm.
two children before she was married, and at the Catholic institution, noses were turned up at her for getting pregnant.
Yeah.
But if she would have had an abortion, then so it just really the bigger picture helped me to see a
Mhm.
lot of the double bind that women especially are in. And I know
Yeah,
people of all genders can be impacted by abortion, and trans folks
sure,
uh,
sure.
can require abortions. I acknowledge that. And from a religious perspective, it does very much feel like this unfair situation we put women in.
Yeah.
It's very much the, you know, you got to punch out a bunch of babies, but you better do it the right way. Because if you don't, then you're going to be wrong in our eyes either. And I had a couple other clients who were in very interesting, I'll just put it this way, they were just in very interesting situations around their pregnancies. And it brought up a lot of discussions around what that even meant for them, and a lot of the unfair standards that were being imposed on them by their families. I met another person who came from a very Republican family that made her have so many abortions because of how it would look in the community. And they're like, but yeah, of course we fight the pro-life cause, but we're just not going to tell people. So once I started kind of really seeing the lay of the land outside of the church bubbles in which I was raised, it's like, how can I not fight for safe abortion medical care being provided to people? And at that point, it really felt more of an issue of, and I say this now very publicly, because of my faith, and because I believe my faith helps me to see this bigger picture. Of course, I want people to be able to access any healthcare that they need safely. And this is a legitimate healthcare issue that I think has been conflated into a scare tactic.
Yeah. Nice.
Yep. So it's been a journey. And I look back on
it's a journey.
A lot of the beliefs I espoused as a younger person, and I could feel shame for some of those. And then I look at my bigger picture of, I really was not shown another worldview. And when I was, then I started to wonder, but I'm getting too away from the church. Is this why I'm struggling in other areas?
Right.
So,
well, that's what I was going to mention too, is like, it's exposure. It's talking with other people. It's using language in different ways. You know, I've even had conversations with people, even my own experience. And you mentioned this, right? It's like abortion means something specifically to people that they usually have some implicit idea about the kind of person who has an abortion, but a termination for medical reasons is something different. An interruption of pregnancy is something different. So, but we're not even allowed to have these conversations often in our families, in our greater society. And so I think just exposure, and then the more that you start to talk to people, then you do get exposed to maybe Catholics for Choice or people who are open to these as larger conversations. And not even just necessarily about abortion, but also birth control and how that works out for people, and people being able to limit the size of their families because that's what's right for their families. So I think it's a lot of interesting things that we don't allow for often. And thank you
for thank you for shouting out Catholics for Choice. They're a wonderful organization. I've had some interaction with them, especially here in Ohio last year when we were passing the referendum. And Faith Choice Ohio is another great group that I'd like to shout out. I know that similar groups exist in other states. And I think when I started to realize that, wow, there are other people of faith, people of deep faith, who see, I guess I go back to Reverend Terry's words, who see the bigger picture here, who are willing to ask questions, because so much of the Catholic ethic in many contexts, knowing that there's all different kinds of Catholics, as we've established, is this is what the church teaches, so you accept it, period. In the evangelical context, you would get, this is what the Bible teaches, but even the Bible, as I've learned, is so open to interpretation. So open to interpretation.
So open.
And I think a lot of us, like who align with Catholics for Choice, for instance, we're willing to ask questions. And something that I talk about in the book, because a question I get a lot, and I reference a conference where this question came up. And since you work with parents a lot in the perinatal community, this might be interesting. As a parent, is it okay to subject your children to religion? Can you raise your children in a religious faith and a religious tradition? Because I was asked at this conference, the way you're talking, that sounds abusive, that I'm making my
I
children
remember that part.
go,
Yeah.
go to
Mhm.
church or whatnot.
Mhm.
And on my honest feeling in chewing it over is I think it's a beautiful thing to
Mhm.
introduce a child to tradition, especially if that faith tradition might be
Mhm.
very tied with the larger culture in which the family comes from, etc. Um, but are you going to allow your child the capacity to ask questions,
Mhm.
to grow into the human they are supposed to grow into,
Mhm.
and not use religion as a way to shoot that down? And obviously, being queer, for queer folks, for trans folks, that
Mhm.
often is a time where children's selfhood, personhood is really demeaned and demoralized in the name of religion. To me, yes, that can very well be abusive.
Mhm.
It is abusive. I
Mhm.
don't think taking your child to church and exposing them is, but if you're doing it as a condition to like have food and shelter, yeah, that's a problem.
Right. Right.
Um,
Yeah.
but I think being able to ask questions and have your doubts is how faith
Mhm.
grows.
Mm.
And I've been in many contexts, and you
Mhm.
may recall from the book, I even talk about my third big experience of faith, which was spending time at a yoga ashram
Mhm.
and having a teacher there continually say, I'm trying to shortcut your doubts. I'm trying to
Mhm.
shortcut your doubts. Like, you're not allowed to have doubts
Mm.
because that'll get in the way
Whew.
of you realizing your true
Mhm.
self.
Mhm.
And shit, being able to dance with so many of my doubts is how my faith has grown, and how I think I've been able to be who I need to be for my fellow humankind,
Yeah.
which is a holy act, and as far as we're concerned.
Mhm. Yeah. Nice. Shifting gears again, if you don't mind, I would
Not
like
at all.
to kind of weave in a little bit of our clinical worldviews, maybe.
Mhm,
I know Institute for Creative Mindfulness's Touchstone is largely connected to EMDR as a clinical
mhm,
intervention. I
yep,
don't think it's specific to EMDR. You know, we can apply brain
mhm,
spotting. I don't know, can it apply your trauma therapy of choice? But when I talk to clients a lot, I talk a lot about, and training consultees, I talk a lot about, you know, we can't make other people, and you kind of talked about this a little bit
mhm,
before too. We can't make other people do things or change the past.
mhm.
So, how do you think of how EMDR or any of our other trauma modalities can be applied to the issues that you discuss in your book?
Yeah, yeah. Well, EMDR is my biggest lane. Expressive
Mhm.
arts is my second lane. So I'll speak to EMDR first. That EMDR does work very strongly with the notion of negative cognition. And so much of what accompanies unhealed trauma is a negative cognition, either about self or about the world. And a
Mhm.
lot of the classic ones would be, I'm not good enough, I cannot trust myself,
Mhm.
the world is a bad place,
Mhm.
etc.
Mhm.
Um, and if you look at the touchstone or the origin story of so many of those negative cognitions, for those of us who get those worldviews or those beliefs about self as a result of religion or toxic faith or spirituality, of course, EMDR can be used to target the source of that.
Mhm.
It's
Mhm.
why we're still here and alive. Our
Yes.
first three biggest EMDR targets we cleared all had religion woven in somehow,
Oh.
or a lot of just toxicity that my father used religion to reinforce.
Mhm. Mhm.
So yeah, I am a big believer that EMDR. I mean, I think of Mara when she says this. It's 8 phases and 3 prongs, and it's
Mm.
widely applicable to any variety of trauma. And even now, a lot of folks who've done a lot are inspiring us to do more anti-racist work, anti-oppression work with
Mhm.
EMDR. There's this
Mhm.
notion that yes, no amount of EMDR can change shittily oppressive systems that might be out there, and church
Mhm.
can be one of them. But
Mhm.
what EMDR can help me to shift is how I see what I believe about myself, even after having
Mhm.
gone through this oppressive
Mhm.
system, essentially.
Mhm.
And yeah, for that, I'm very grateful. It can help people break out of these
Mhm.
confines. And it's a beautiful thing. My other major therapy I practice and facilitate is expressive arts therapy, which is the connection that we as humans can have to all of these channels of expression: art, music, writing. As expressive arts therapists, we look at them in combination. And what that really helps us to do is work really with aspects of ourselves that we just can't put into words, or maybe can't put into words in any kind of neat flow. Like the whole title, You Lied to Me About God, came from a very angry stream of consciousness, nonsensical poem that I wrote. And it was like after a really tough EMDR session. And it was like, you lied to me about God. You lied to me. And it was at my parent, at the church, at this, at the other. And so
it was your adaptive information processing system kicking in.
So you know this, Leslie, that to me, at its most basic foundational definition, trauma is just an unhealed human wound. That we have more technical definitions we can put on it from different scholars, etc. Yet the English word trauma comes from the Greek word meaning wound. And wounds can come in all different shapes and sizes. They could need different layers, different characteristics of healing. Spiritual and religious wounding are wounds, just like physical wounds can be, just like sexual wounds can be, emotional wounds. So why wouldn't we use these trauma processing mechanisms we have available to us to help us go there? And I know for myself, this may be of interest to some listeners. As a person with a deep spiritual sensibility and connection, when I engage in EMDR therapy or expressive arts therapy, there's a lot of spiritual content that comes through. And I use a lot of my spiritual practices as resources. And I've been able to move towards positive cognitions, like I'm okay as I am in the eyes of my creator.
Nice. Do you have any advice? Well, let me back up before I finish this question. So I think I slid into your DMs, as it were, after I finished reading your book a couple of weeks ago. And I was like, holy cow, like this book has given me an invitation to explore my own spiritual identity that I thought we were done with this. And so
surprise.
I know, surprise. So I wonder if you have any advice to people who are exploring their spiritual identity.
Oh, I love that question. Because we're not supposed to give advice as therapists, but you're asking for advice, and it's
an interview. You don't. I do all the time.
Oh wow. Yeah. Wow. Love this question. Spirituality, having a connection with spirit, with the divine, with those things that are greater than you, however you're defining it, it is so much bigger than anything any religious institution taught you it was. And to be clear, I think religious institutions and faith traditions, even more specifically than the institution, can be beautiful carriers of things like lineage or custom or tradition, even ritual that can be quite nourishing. So I don't, on one hand, it's a dialectic, it's a both and. So maybe that's my big advice here, like embrace the both and.
Yeah.
That religious and spiritual practice can still be very beautiful. And I know that God, spirit, who I've met in my healing, is so much bigger than any one of those traditions or practices can contain. So keep an open mind, heart, and spirit to that. And exploring that you might encounter spirit. Like I feel I'm encountering spirit in this conversation I'm having with you. You know, heart to heart, human to human. There's something very spiritual here for me that I don't have to go into the building of a church to get. And I did a reel here. I could send this to you as well for the show notes, because it's a really fun reel where I talked to some folks who showed up in You Lied to Me About God, because they're people in my family of choice. And I asked them, what's the biggest lie that someone ever told you about God, or the biggest lie
Ooh.
that someone ever told you about yourself in God's name. And my good friend, Reverend John Michael, who is a gay psychic, son of an EMDR therapist. He's really cool. Very, very dear friend.
Sounds
And
like
he
it.
said he said they make God small. That in a
Yeah.
lot of our religions,
Mm,
he's an old guy with a beard sitting up on a
mm,
cloud.
mm,
And God is everything. God
mm,
is in everything, or spirit, if you like, is in everything. Uh,
mhm,
Shapeshifter,
mhm,
formless. I have a line in the book where I talk about I've met a God that's gender
mhm.
fluid, that's gender queer, who can show up as they need to show
Mm.
up.
Yeah,
So
nice.
yeah, don't make God small. That's my
That's a
advice.
good one. Nice. Is there anything that you think I forgot to ask, or anything more that you wanted to share with us about this book?
Well, this is just absolutely beautiful. I thank Touchstone and
Mhm,
Tuesday Tea for hosting me. Your founder, Mara Tesler Stein,
mhm,
has chatted with me in
mhm,
courses before that
mhm,
we've done on spiritual abuse and religious trauma, and just a willingness for groups to have conversations and talk about it, I believe is so
mhm.
important in it's kind of trite and cliche to say in this day and age, but I will say it because religion is getting weaponized in new ways in the US
Yeah,
political climate especially.
yeah,
And it's important for us to be cognizant of how this is impacting the people we serve, our clients.
yeah. Okay. Well, I want to just say thank you so much. I almost feel the need to say namaste because, the light in my heart shines towards the light in your heart and then light in all hearts. As a yoga, and my yoga mat is quite an important part of my spiritual practice these days. But it
Mhm.
has been just a great conversation. I'm really, really appreciative of you sharing this book, sharing your story with the world, and sharing it with the Tuesday Tea listeners and watchers. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Leslie.
Mhm.